Welcome to the Defining Moments Black Men series of the Authentic Joe Show. I'm your host, Jolena Johnson, and it is my privilege to welcome today's guest, Mr. Orlando DeBruce. How are you today?
I'm quite well. How are you, Jolena?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Can you tell us a little about yourself, your occupation, and your background?
So, I am a native of the Midwest. I was born in St. Louis at St. Louis University Hospital. I was raised across the river in East St. Louis. I'm a very proud citizen of East St. Louis. I attended the University of Missouri Columbia School of Journalism. When I graduated, I worked in the news business for more than a decade. I finished my career as a traditional journalist, working as a Washington correspondent covering the Bill Clinton administration. I left news in 1999 and I was recruited out here to the Bay Area where I currently reside, working in Silicon Valley as a corporate global media professional. And so my friends like to say I went from news to the dark side, but I enjoy being on this side of media as well because I get to work with journalists globally. I've traveled to more than 100 countries working with media around the world and learning the different nuances between, let's say, domestic media and media in Asia, for example,
Mm,
are vastly different. So
sure.
I've spent the second half of my career in corporate communications.
Okay, that is wonderful. I met you just a couple days before my freshman year started at school. And from the very first moment, you were so kind and nice, and it's never changed. You were always very sweet to me, and I appreciate that. So, can you tell us how you would describe yourself?
I would describe myself as an independent thinker,
Mhm.
a collaborator, and a servant leader, really.
Okay. Okay.
And I try to bring all three of those components into my workspace and my personal space. And the challenge is to remain authentic as an authentic Joe show. It's to remain authentic no matter the situation. And sometimes it's challenging. And
Mhm.
so when things become complicated, I try to fall back on those core, I call them my core values,
Okay.
part of my core values. And I try to translate that over to my team. When I supervise a team, I customize my style depending on who I'm working with.
Oh,
And so that's worked for me so far. My teams like to travel with me when I move around on different jobs. And it also allows them to be very open with me in terms of their careers and what they're thinking, probably a little bit more so than the boss uh, employee dynamic. So I try to put myself, I was in their shoes. And so I try to lead with that empathy.
okay.
And so that's how I would describe.
Okay. Thank you. So, if you had to pick a phrase that would be the theme for your life, what would that be?
I'm going to borrow from Maya Angelou because I do believe that people remember how you make them feel.
Hmm.
And then I would probably just add, I would add, interact with grace with people because we are all imperfect, you know. And I would add to that, and I would add the Bible because it says, God, Jesus said, trust in Him, love people. He didn't say trust people but because we're imperfect, right? And so I try to keep that in mind when I'm faced with disappointment
Hmm.
from people in general,
Okay.
and even with myself,
Hmm.
just to give myself and those people grace,
Okay.
because most of the time people try to do the best that they can with what they had at that particular time.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Orlando. So, oftentimes people say, well, what is a defining moment? So, let me share. A defining moment is a point in life when a pivotal decision must be made or when an experience fundamentally changes a person. What defining moment would you be willing to share with us today?
So I did think about this question, and the one moment that keeps popping up in my mind is around my dad. And I think the defining moment has evolved,
Okay.
and then it really impacted me when I was a reporter in Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay.
Um, and that moment is understanding what it means and what it meant back in the 70s and 80s, to be raised by a single father when all the messages you hear, and most of them are true, is that women, particularly Black women, are unable to provide for their children.
Okay.
And so
We lost you.
yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so a defining moment is recognizing who I was raised by and how special that was as a young Black boy growing up. Um, I used to wonder why, when my dad would come up to the school, that all of the teachers, most of whom were women, most of whom were Black women, would just celebrate him because he was
Mm.
raising five kids. Now I was just thinking, well, that's what he's supposed to do. He's a
Mhm.
parent. But then as I got older, I realized different. But it really hit me, Jolena, I think when I was in Jacksonville, Florida, 24, 25, a reporter. And I did a story on single Black fathers raising
Mm.
their kids. I had a city councilman, a businessman, and a high school educator, all Black men raising their kids. And I wrote a column with that piece talking about my experiences, right? And then I remember I called the federal government to get a stat. And at that time, it was immeasurable. They were like, we don't have a stat. There are not enough of y'all doing this, basically. But when that story was published, the impact it had on the community um, later impacted me, particularly Black women in Jacksonville. I had a lot of sisters calling me at the newsroom wanting to make my dad and I stuff, hats and coats or whatever. But what it did for me was made me realize, number one, that that was somewhat unique, and number two, that I need to share that story,
Mhm.
right, more often.
Mhm.
And number three, the responsibility of what it means to be a man, really,
Yes.
because my father didn't run away from his responsibilities. In fact, really short story. My father said our mother couldn't take care of us. Our mother said he stole us from her. My grandmother, who I believe, my dad's mother, said my father was worried about. He was one of those guys who couldn't live without his kids,
Okay.
right? And
Okay.
so my mom was from Detroit, and my dad was from St. Louis and East St. Louis. We were living in Detroit, and he
Okay.
would drive from St. Louis to Detroit and spy on us. And because he had the resources to raise us, and he wanted to raise us, and then we had aunts and uncles, and my mom really didn't have the resources. He was awarded us, five of us. I'm number four or five.
Wow.
And he took that on. And so I took that for granted. And I think my brother and I took that for granted a little bit. But it defines, it lets me know that, if I were to ever become a parent, that is not my goal, but if I were, that
Mhm.
I have to step up to the plate because that's what I saw, you
Mhm.
know. I also use the experiences and the advice that he has given me and pass it on. My very best friend is a single dad in LA. And I told him about my father, and he calls me all the time. What did your father do in this situation? What did he do in that situation?
Mm.
He has only one kid. And so it made me realize I need to share that story with more men, particularly men of color, because the messages we hear, and they're true all the time, is that, you don't hear so much about that now. There are more men stepping up than back in the day, but
Mhm.
still there needs to be more. And so it really, it really underscored to me that I need to make sure that that part of the story is told as well. Not all of us were fatherless, you
Yes.
know.
Yes.
It's just not the point, and some fathers wanted to be around their kids, and
Mhm.
because he was a man, he had to get up and go to work.
Mhm.
You know, the government wasn't giving us anything. He had to work. So that discipline that a lot of people, even at my job, credit me for, I got from him. I saw a black man get up and go to work 2 o'clock every day, you know, from K through 12th grade. And my dad was a shoe buyer. He worked in St. Louis. He loved fashion. He sold shoes for a Jewish company in St. Louis. And so he was very sharp, and he was very meticulous about stuff, which is why he couldn't stay married, because he could cook and change a flat and wash clothes and do everything,
Okay.
seriously,
Okay.
every single thing. And he taught us, that his boys, how to be self-sufficient, because his mother taught him that.
Okay.
And so, but the Florida news story and the reaction to it was a huge impact on me. I called my father. I was like, all of these people are really reading this story. And it just made his day. And I remember sitting in the newsroom thinking, I just really, you know, it was like, no, I really just kind of took it all for granted, you know, the kind of representation he was sort of showing us was not perfect at all. He was
Mhm.
not perfect, you know. And he was good at choosing what I call bonus mothers, but not good at keeping them. Latia's mom is a bonus mother when he married her. And so, but not good at keeping them because he was such a perfectionist, you
Mhm.
know? And so, and there are things how he liked things, and, you know, he was very picky about, you know, how tidy the house has to be and all that stuff. But it really instilled in us how we should live and how to be responsible as young men.
Okay, well, thank you. So I have a couple of questions. So first of all, I had no idea that you were raised by your dad, and I had no idea that it was five of you. That's amazing. So inquiring minds want to know. So how many bonus moms did you have?
Let me see. One, two, three, uh, either three or four. I lost count.
Wow. So
Yeah,
he really tried to stay married. He really
he
tried.
he
Okay.
did. And really quickly, Jolene, the common thread was they all loved us. They all were really good women, you know. Um,
I got it. Okay, that's enough. That's enough. Okay. So, being raised by your dad, you already said something very important. You said he did not get aid because he was a man and he got up every day and worked for two, got up and left at 2 o'clock in the morning. So, what are some other things? What are three other things that you got from your experience that shaped you being raised by your father?
you know, I think he used to, when we would have to go somewhere like special, whatever, particularly with the boys, he would call us down and inspect us. Kind of, if you're part of the Divine Nine, you know what I mean? Because I like to say, I pledge before I pledge. And so he would inspect and make sure that we were representing ourselves well, you know. So he was very much into, um, looking the part and looking
Okay.
tidy, number
Okay.
one.
Okay.
Um, and then the second thing was his discipline. My father was very disciplined. We could tell you by the hour what he was doing, but the good thing about that was it made him successful, right? Because he was disciplined, he was very responsible. He was known in the neighborhood. If people needed, he was like the neighborhood dad too.
Okay.
And if people needed something, particularly women, advice or whatever, they would come to him. Money, anything, they would come to him. And so he shared, and he was sort of like a community leader, even though that wasn't his goal to be
Gotcha.
that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I have to balance this out. I have to say too that what I learned from him from one of his negatives was that I think he was a bit too much of a perfectionist,
Okay.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think I was guilty of that earlier in my career.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and because of that, he didn't get to do a lot of things, right, Jolene? I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
worked so hard. I mean, he had a family, whatever, and did a lot of things. He didn't vacation a lot. He didn't know how to vacation.
Mm-hmm.
When he retired and was about to go on vacations, he got sick. You know, he didn't really. I would say that he didn't really enjoy life
Okay.
as much as he could have. So
Okay.
that is why I make sure I balance. I got a strong work ethic, but
Hmm.
I also like to balance that out with experience in life and doing things and traveling or whatever. So I learned as much from his negatives as I did from his positives.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Very good. Okay. So, um, as we are talking about these things and you think about life, as you said, you're not a father, you don't necessarily intend to be. Um, what would you say to a young man who's growing up now and maybe his father isn't present? What are three pieces of advice? Now you can it can be to a young person, period, but what are three pieces of advice that you would give a young person growing up in today's world?
Number one would be to find a male in your community. It doesn't have to be a relative that you admire, like so many kids did with my father,
Hmm.
and try to connect with them,
Okay.
and use them, position them as a mentor,
Okay.
because there's someone out there who would love to do that job. Number two, don't look at it as a vulnerability per se, or don't react to it as if it's a vulnerability. Um, Being raised by your mom can be your superpower, you
Okay.
know, and then whatever else you need, you can go out and complement that, supplement that through other sources. And then just make sure that when you're in a position of being a dad, that you don't repeat the cycle, you
Very
know.
good. Yeah.
And if you need to understand how that works, then I take you back to step one. Get
There
a
you go.
mentor who is a dad,
Yes.
who
Yes.
can teach you.
That's wonderful.
Um,
Okay. Well, okay. So I have one last question before we go. Well, I have two questions, but one question about your story. So was it four boys and one girl?
no, I have two older sisters, an
Okay.
older brother who transitioned, and then it's me and Michael. So I'm number four or five.
Okay. Gotcha.
Three boys and two girls.
Okay. Very good. All
Uh,
right.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your defining moment and thank you for sharing about your family. And before we go, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the series. I think in this climate of black men and police brutality and all the pressures, I think it is important to highlight black male leadership,
Mhm.
responsibility,
Mhm.
and that sort of thing. It's not to overshadow the other stuff, but it's to
Right.
balance out the information. Because sometimes I think it's easy to get distracted by a lot of the negatives,
Yes.
And I think that was the purpose of me doing that story in Jacksonville.
Hmm.
It was to, I saw that, speaking of
Hmm.
superpowers, I saw these single black men because it was my experience. There were other journalists who knew these guys too, and it just didn't dawn on them because
Right.
that wasn't the messaging that was out there.
Right.
And it became one of my biggest stories in Jacksonville. So I would say, Link, find out what your superpower. Don't think about so much all the time what you don't have, because
Hmm.
you may have what you need, and you
Hmm.
probably have more than what you think you have. And that is your superpower. And whatever your unique experience of being raised is,
Hmm.
and you have figured it out, that's what makes you different. And lean on that, because your story is not going to be the same as everyone else's, nor should it, really.
Thank you so much, Orlando, for sharing that. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your global schedule to be here on the Authentic Joe Show. All right. Take great care. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my God. It's Jolena.